today we're going to be doing part 2 of a 6-part series that we're calling the 3 I's of emotional intelligence, or the 3 I's of EQ. And those 3 I's are identify, illustrate, and implement. It's great to know about it, but how can you put it to best use in your life and your organization? So in the series, we're going to talk about 5 components of emotional intelligence. And then we're going to discuss 2 better ways to visualize kind of how you can use EQ, and also 3 action items on how to go about implementing that in your organization or in your life. So last time we talked about self-awareness, which is really the root of all of it. If you are not aware of where you're triggered or how your emotions go, there's nothing you can do about it if you're not aware of it. You can't fix it if you don't know about it. So with that, that goes into the next part, is self-regulation. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Tom, what were your thoughts on last week's one on self-awareness and how that kind of rolls into the self-regulation? And tell us exactly what we mean by self-regulation.
Well, last week when we talked about self-awareness, that's looking inwardly and just being aware of your emotional capacity, what you're just being in touch with yourself, your own feelings. And when you start to look at self-regulation, that's how we now are going to regulate those impulses, those emotional thoughts, those emotional feelings that we have. So by being aware, I think that's really where we're going with this. That's really what self is all about. Self awareness, self-regulation. It has to start someplace. It starts between our 2 ears. So the idea is to be aware. And from that point, we can do something with our emotional skill sets.
Yes, that is why, and we'll talk about this. There's a couple of books that we're going to talk about throughout this series. Obviously, Daniel Goleman's seminal work on emotional intelligence is great to dig into. He's got some follow-up books, but also I really, really like Dr. Marshall Goldsmith's book on triggers, because this is where this part of it comes into play. If you're not aware of it, you don't know what happens. But when you're aware of it, the idea of the book Triggers was the fact that when you are aware enough to figure out where you're triggered or where your issues are, once you identify it, that gives you cognitively that split second difference between what happens and my reaction, what happens in my reaction. And so if you just automatically react, then just what it is. But if you have that split second of time in between there, Marshall Goldsmith talks about, then you can actually, your prefrontal cortex can actually do something about it. Your higher function cognitive abilities can say, no, I'm not going to raise a fit at the meeting. I'm not going to do this. I can decide how I'm going to react.
Yes, and another way of looking at that is a simple way to look at it. We don't know that we don't know. So if we don't know that we don't know, we're left out. But once we become aware of the fact that, okay, I've got something to do, I have a way to respond, and my first impulse might be to respond the old way, which would be very reactionary and would probably cause more harm than good. So that's where we're really helping people get a maturity level of how to handle their emotions. So that's where we're going with the awareness and self-regulation.
Yes. And one of the things that I'm glad that you mentioned that part, because when you talk about emotional intelligence and EQ and assessment and stuff like that, one of the things that it strikes me is, of all the assessment tools that we have that are appropriate for hiring, that are EEOC compliant, that are bias free and no disparate impact on any particular group, one of the things that they don't recommend for hiring, because it doesn't necessarily meet muster, is this particular one right here. Let's talk about EQ, because there is a difference with maturity. There is a difference with experience. There is a difference with age. And you have somebody who is in their 50s or 60s that's had a lot more experiences and realized, you know what, when I was rash and I put my foot in my mouth or I said stupid things that, and in the middle, well, that's just how I feel, I'm just being myself. They realize, that didn't turn out so well. And so that maturity level tempers. And I think you'll see an increase. Well, you see an increase across the board in the data that with age, you start to have some just general increases in emotional intelligence. So that is the one assessment that as soon as you said maturity, just rang to my head that, we don't necessarily recommend, we don't necessarily use for hiring purposes, because it does make a difference, in age. Age does have an effect on it, where in a lot of the stuff that we use, it doesn't have any effect.
Absolutely.
But no, what else? We talked about the actual the definition of self-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I mean, the way I look at it, I mean, we have emotions, and I mean, sometimes, I mean, things can happen, and it's very easy to be reactionary.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, being able to take in and have that split second where you can suspend judgment and think before acting and choose your response,
Mm-hmm.
at least temper down. I mean, even the choices, I don't want to act this way, but it's such a habit. Maybe I would have really blown up, but now I just kind of make a smile comment. I'm still doing the action, but maybe it's less severe. I'm kind of dialing that back. It doesn't necessarily have to be a complete and total personality change in one set. It's just not going to happen then.
But Dave, I think what can happen oftentimes is we actually have an internal conversation going on with ourself, and that thought process you're referring to, I know with myself, there are certain times the first thought that pops in my head in a way I should respond to somebody, I think to myself, now that's not very emotionally mature. I have to tune that down and say, wait a minute, now what's a better way to respond in this situation? And that's where our emotional maturity starts to really has an effect on that outcome of that conversation or that situation. So I think that's where we're going with this. When we can realize that, okay, we have this conversation going on within our brain and we have a choice. Now, it's not where we're just someone pushed a button and we react, but they've pushed a button and we're going to think through it. We're going to have an option or two of how we choose to respond. And that's going to have a dramatic impact on the results of that relationship or that conversation or that meeting that you're part of or that you're leading.
Absolutely. Is it going to get better by what you say? Is it going to get worse?
That's right.
That's right. What am I doing to improve the situation versus what am I doing just to be reactionary to, self-gratification for the time? I get that instant hit of, all right, that's right, I told them off. But did that really do you any good in the long run?
That's right. And we see this happen all the time. A principal of a company, business owner, manager, they're running a meeting. People very often are not going to challenge that person. So whatever that person says has a direct impact on those people that are in that meeting. And if you're not communicating in a way that's emotionally mature, you're going to have a less than optimum effect on those people. And as a result, they're not going to be able to perform their jobs very well if they can't trust you enough to communicate back to you in a way that's going to create the kind of situation where there's true communication that's going back and forth.
If you're, like I said, you're running a business, if you really think about it with your division, your team, your whatever, kind of to the old adage, one of us isn't as good as all of us. And when you're really trying to think of ideas and different ways of doing things or ways to improve or how can we do this better, when you look at yourself as a leader, it doesn't matter. I mean, Goldsmith talked about in one of his books about generals and admirals. When they talk, it's an order. When they give a suggestion, it's an order. When they just say, hey, what do you think about? It's an order. So it always comes across as an order. So when you're in a meeting, it's just say, hey, this is what I think. What do you guys think about it? Well, you've already laid the groundwork of what you think. So that's one of them. You automatically give your reaction because that's what you're used to doing. And then how does that set the tone for other people? Like, okay, we already know they've already put his cards on the table, so we don't want to stray too far away from that. And then if you do get something that's maybe contrarian to what you were thinking and you react poorly to it, they're like, hey, I'm not doing that again. I need this job. I'm not going to. So what's going to happen? You're going to stifle innovation. You're going to stifle creativity. And basically, you're going to get a whole bunch of people like, yeah, yep, whatever you say, boss, we're good. Yep.
And cool, we've seen examples of that on a national level, global level, where large companies, they had a leader who just was emotionally immature and more of a do it my way or the highway. And it led to catastrophe for that company. So
yeah, I mean, it's easy to you talk about the phenomenon of groupthink, and it's easy to get into that perspective when you have somebody that's not as open to that, or they don't even realize because they're not self-aware, they don't self-regulate, they don't realize how they come across sometimes. And that's the sad part, because they think they're being good, but they don't even realize how they come across, but they set that stage to lower the creativity, lower the engagement, lower the reactions from everybody else. Like, cool, I'm going to go in a meeting, I'm going to check the box, I'm going to do my thing and get my check and keep going. And that really hurts the productivity and the creativity and the growth of your organization. And in the long run, your engagement and a lot of times your turnover.
That's right. Dave, in the book by Daniel Goleman on working with emotional intelligence, he points out that companies that have leaders in place with high emotional maturity, high emotional intelligence, are more profitable than companies that are led by individuals who do not have a high emotional intelligence. So they have statistics that back this up. It is good for the bottom line.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the one thing that's been very difficult sometimes to quantify. And that's why a lot of the scientific research is very helpful. Intuitively, you know this stuff is good, but if you don't have the hard numbers to back it up, hey, this is not soft, Triogi woo-woo kind of like feel-good stuff, kumbaya around the campfire. There's real, it's just like employee engagement and productivity stats. I mean, there is real data behind the more engaged your workforce is, the more productive they are, and then of course the more profitable you are. So I mean, that's a big one.